A conversation about personal identity and surviving mind uploading with Dr. Keith Wiley. Dr. Keith Wiley is the author of the book A Taxonomy and Metaphysics of Mind Uploading, as well as numerous theoretical papers addressing questions about consciousness, the survival of personal identity during a putative mind uploading procedure, the wetness of simulated water, and related issues. Dr. Wiley has been deeply embedded in the community interested in research and development of whole brain emulation. He was one of the earliest members of the Mind Uploading Research Group, and he is presently the Director of Communication for the Carboncopies Foundation, as well as a scientific advisor to the Brain Preservation Foundation. Among many other expertise and interests, Dr. Wiley is also an experimental explorer of neuromorphic hardware and its applications. Typically, when we have workshops, we try to discuss technical things. So we try to talk about data acquisition or brain preservation or reconstruction, modeling, that sort of thing. But at the same time, we always get questions that are of a different nature. So for example, some of the main questions that we get are, can you create consciousness in an artificial brain? Or if your brain is reconstructed, do you survive such an upload in the sense that your personal identity carries on? And because these are such common questions, they do belong somewhere in a roadmap to whole brain emulation. They deserve some kind of explicit treatment, and that's what we're going to do for this update of the roadmap. We talked about consciousness in a previous workshop, and now we're going to talk about personal identity. Now, when we talk about these topics, we try to keep them as independent as possible, just to have less complexity in the sense that there are other things to argue about. So for example, when we talked about consciousness, we simply assumed that the whole data acquisition problem and modeling and all of that was solved, and you could do whatever you wanted to create consciousness in a machine. And in this case, when we talk about personal identity, we're going to assume that questions like that, as well as questions of consciousness in an artificial brain, that those are resolved in some sense, and we're really just talking about the personal identity problem here. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't reach back. This happened with the conversation I just recently had with Professor Jeff McMahon as well, because once you really dig into a specific view of personal identity or surviving mind uploading, then sometimes you have to reach back to whatever your understanding is of the problem of consciousness or sustaining consciousness. So that does, of course, happen. In any case, throughout this conversation, I may try to paraphrase some things that Jeff McMahon said, and I hope I do him justice, because you haven't had a chance to see the interview yet that we did, and it was a really great interview. I really enjoyed talking to him. So I'm going to try to paraphrase him from time to time, and I hope I get it right. But what I wanted to start with, before we talk about the problem of surviving mind uploading, is just to maybe say a few things about personal identity, or how we're supposed to think about that. And this is because very often when we talk about something like consciousness or personal identity, many of the arguments begin when people are coming at it from different directions and have a different definition of what these words mean or what they're really talking about. So, how do you think we should think about personal identity? What should we think of there? So, for instance, one of the things that I was toying with was the notion that personal identity might not be identity in the sense of identical, so it might not be a binary yes-no. It could be a graded thing. Jeff had some choice words about that. What do you think?
Well, yeah. In mathematics, I suppose identity actually has a specific meaning, and then we sort of generalize it in other conversations. And you can't make a meaningful use of identity being a perfect, quality in a mathematical sense, because then you couldn't identify yourself with yourself, from a moment ago, based on the fact that there are selves.
Right.
So this is widely recognized in philosophy of mind, and the common solution is to very rapidly dispense with this need for a perfect quality and instead speak in terms of things that make a lot of sense. Our identity is this sort of persistence across time, even if it's slowly evolving, and that's perfectly fine, as long as we admit that right out of the gate we've taken this notion that identity is some sort of perfect equality, and that's not what we're talking about. You've just given up on that use of the term, right? Everyone's just on board with that, but you gotta get that laid out early, because someone will come in and talk about this sort of identicality notion. You just have to get everyone to agree that clearly that's not what we're talking about. So for me, what we call personal identity is this notion of our psychological notion of who we are. I definitely put that into sort of two things. One is our memories. Not everyone really sort of relies on memories. That's what's called the psychological theory of identity. People are drawn to other things that might identify themselves. The big one is body identity. You are identified by the physical thing that you are. All of these quickly run into conundrums. The body identity faces the sort of steady breakdown of parts. You can have amputations, or just the fact that your body is trading out material parts in a ship of Theseus sort of way all the time. So then you have to adapt your body identity to some kind of like momentary state in this ongoing sort of stream of change. Memories are, of course, also problematic because they're still changing. So you can't say that your identity is, this set of memories, because those memories are, again, as I just said a second ago, they're different 2 seconds later. So, and then the other thing I was saying, there were two sort of components of identity for me personally, and definitely I think memories are, an integral component of it. Your identity is definitely who you believe yourself to be based on a lifetime of experience leading up to the current moment, which has profound implications for what amnesia means in terms of identity. And I basically embrace the complexities that introduces. A really deep-seated amnesia imply that you are not actually the same person in some sense, and I'm willing to at least explore that. The other thing that is clearly sort of a crucial component of our identity is what we call our momentary, that's the exact word, momentary consciousness. Speech is present. This is just our sense of what we feel like we are right now at this exact moment, which of course is completely intertwined in our memories. What you feel like right now is the culmination of your memories sort of impinging on your current conscious experience. So it all gets knotted together. But it's what we call the stream of consciousness, or the conscious experience in speech is present. This feeling that we are this sort of entity right here, right now, is an important part of our identity. And it gets completely knotted up in the arguments about the implications of identity under sort of hypothetical kind of living scenarios. The big one everyone gets all knotted up about.
Yeah.
The big one everyone likes to argue about is this non-destructive scenario.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah. So,
isn't it funny, though, that what you mentioned before about body identity, or identity in terms of memories, other characteristics, psychological continuity in some sense, that is, those all seem somewhat separate from this sense of being here, this momentary consciousness. They don't really directly connect to that. And if you were to talk about, say, the identity of a table, even if that table gets scratches over the years and stuff like that, you could talk about the same sort of body identity of the table or something like that. And there would be no... Yeah, and there would be no component that has anything to do with a sense of being here in the moment.
No, it's definitely this can we just identify physical objects by sort of their the limitations of their spatial existence?
Yeah, and at the same time, when you talk about this momentary sense of being here, that's the thing that is considered to be so important, and at the same time that turns on and off. You don't have that when you're unconscious or when you're in certain states of sleep and all of that. And then it comes back again. Yeah, and somehow this combination of those two things is really what people think of as, your personal identity or self. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, so you're touching upon some of the issues right there, because the next point, of course, is what would you, how would you define or how would you think about persistence of personal identity or survival of personal identity? When does someone survive? When does someone not survive? When does someone cease to exist or start to exist?
Yeah, and I definitely take this to an extreme because, I'll take the situation where, imagine a situation where someone dies, but the information in their brain has not been lost. The brain hasn't been physically damaged yet. You now have sort of two possible outcomes, and I mean sort of over the remaining lifetime of the universe. So that brain, which is now sort of in this not information destroyed state, but the person is dead, they're not dynamically living. If for the next 5 trillion years you never reawaken that brain, then you could rightly say that person's identity has been erased.
Uh-huh.
But at the same time, you could say that if they are put into stasis for 1 trillion years and are then awakened, somehow their identity actually survived. I mean, that the analogy is basically they went to sleep and they woke up. What does it really mean, to get sort of concerned about the death of our identity if you might be able to be revived, literally in 1 trillion years, and you would actually say that is a preservation?
Yeah.
So this is where people get into this notion of information theoretic death. You're never really truly dead, no matter what's going on, until the information that encodes who and what you are in your brain is destroyed. And it really doesn't make any difference whether the brain is actually in a dynamic, experiential, living state at any given moment in time, or even for any given millennia of span. It really isn't important to the death of our identity. Our identity doesn't die until the information that could be used to revive it is actually permanently erased.
There's a little corollary to that, and this is where I'm going to try to paraphrase a part of the conversation with Jeff McMahon, because he was talking to me about, he agrees in large parts with Derek Parfit, and then he has a slight disagreement when it comes to surviving in terms of the copy problem. And we can get into more detail about that in a moment. But what he was talking to Derek Parfit about at one point was that Derek Parfit was saying he doesn't care about the kind of causation as long as there is some sort of causation for how you get from one mental state to another, then you've survived. Even if that causation is someone went and took the blueprint of your brain, copied it, recreated it somewhere else, you survive. No difference. And this is where Jeff McMahon didn't agree with him, but then he had a conversation with Derek and said, well, what if there was a nuclear bomb that exploded over my head, and at the same moment, on the other side of the earth, a reconstructor that can build brains creates a brain at random, and by chance it happens to be my brain. So there's no real causality between that. Would that still be me? And at that point, Derek Parfit admitted that, he doesn't really care about causality either. Even in that case, he would consider that survival. And so that's interesting, because then you could say that even if the information in your brain was completely lost in the sense that there was no record anymore, as long as you did reappear somehow in 1 trillion years, even if it's by chance.
So I was saying that the scenario you described is essentially identical to the Swamp Man thought experiment. And I don't remember. Right,
so I don't know if I lost you at the part where I mentioned that Derek Parfit believes that is a perfectly good way of surviving. But this of course means that even in the case where you never preserved a brain, if somehow you reappear in the future, then you've never died, right?
Boltzmann brain.
Yeah.
if you essentially, if some system comes into existence which represents a continuation, you get lost in the weeds. You can't come to really solid conclusions. I think the best response is put it all on memories and throw everything out, throw everything else out, and just say, if there's a system, a physical system, a brain, a computer that has the internal mental experience of being the continuation of your memories, then that is a continuation of your identity. And I would say that's a continuation of your conscious, like that's not somebody else because they have exactly the same experience that you would have had under a more sort of physically causal scenario. As far as I'm concerned, it's very hard to really prove that other conscious stream causality that we're looking for is real, and I'm inclined to just dismiss it.
Yeah. I understand, of course, this is both your position and it's basically Derek Parfit's position as well. I think there are a few typical arguments that we should at least go over just so that we've covered the bases. So arguments sometimes, and in this case I'm just going to start with the one that Jeff McMahon had, paraphrasing again. His argument is that he feels like it does matter what the type of causation is. He feels there needs to be some kind of overlap, so he's in the camp where a gradual upload is fine, a copy is not fine, and he says that probably there's some sort of rate of replacement cutoff. And for him it feels like at some rate of replacement, that's where you lose yourself. And I wasn't able to pin him down on exactly what that would be, but he feels that somewhere you lose having enough natural causation of going from one state of the mind to the next state of the mind. So for him, for some reason, the type of causation matters.
I mean, you and I published. Did you have him read the paper?
I didn't have him read the paper because I didn't know that this was where he was going to go in the conversation. If I'd known that, I would have asked him to check out that argument first.
I mean,
yeah.
Basically, it seems like he was insightful enough to see where we were going to go with that. And he basically admitted that he was he was getting himself into a position of having to admit that there is some sort of threshold or at least spectrum of transition rates or transition total time periods over which there's some fundamental difference in metaphysical interpretation of identity, and he's anticipating that and putting his flag on it, and that's fine. But that was you and I's, that was our point in our paper, was that we weren't necessarily saying you couldn't take that position, but in order to take that position, you have to do exactly what he said. You have to say, okay, we're gonna own this claim that somehow, in a way that hasn't at all been clarified yet by neurology or psychology, we're just going to assume that there is to be found in the future some meaningful distinction between fast and slow uploading procedures. And I guess my only response is that until that mechanism is discovered, I'm not putting a lot of stock in it.
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine what that would be, because we're not talking about a technical threshold. We're talking about something metaphysical.
The whole point of the thought experiment, and he seems to be on board with the abstraction of it, is to accept the plausibility of sort of the technical plausibility that you could do this, and that you are then going to pin different metaphysical labels on the outcome. I suppose, another problem I have with that is, let's assume that it's right in principle that there is some metaphysical difference, but it can never be physically discovered. It's somehow outside of the reach of physical science. So, then people might argue, okay, so if you upload too fast, it really does produce a copy. But we're all admitting that we could never know, and we'll never discover this.
Well, except, of course, yourself would discover it because you would cease to exist.
Well, how would you know that you cease to? No, But
I
the
know that you
copy,
can't
no, no,
test
no.
that,
But
but
the
it's...
whole point is that the copy doesn't know that they're a copy.
Oh no, the copy doesn't know, of course not.
Right.
But this is where, of course, it becomes like twisting yourself into a pretzel, because you're trying to argue that even though the copy can't tell and no one else can tell, somehow your original self can tell, in the sense that they did not continue. They can't really tell, but it doesn't work that way, because you can't.
We could, if we're going to say that it's valid for you. I was saying that if we're going to allow the quote original to lament his loss of existence, then why aren't we putting equal stock in the conscious experience of the upload? Why are we so willing to say, oh, this poor person feels that they've died or are about to die or dying under this experience, but this other person is espousing their own conscious experience of what they feel is going on, but we just throw that out. We just say, oh, well, you think you know what's going on about your own self and your own identity, but you're wrong. But this other person thinks they know what's going on about their identity, and they're right. Well, in my opinion, that's just a prejudice. Like, that's just, we can say nobody knows anything about their own identity, and we're not going to take anybody's claims at face value. That's fine. Or we can say we're going to take everybody at face value, and that's okay. The branching identity is a perfectly good solution, which we can go into to explain how that works. What I'm opposed to is saying we're going to take the bio-original's claims to be the ground truth, and if the upload's claims and perspective are in disagreement, then we just throw those out. They don't count. Like, I reject that. I don't think that there's any basis for what I see as basically a prejudice. It's a bias in favor of one over the other that is leading the question. It's one thing to say we're going to put this bias on it because we've already determined that identity has been lost, so therefore we will enact the bias in that case.
Yeah.
But it's another thing to say we're still trying to answer the question of when identity is lost, and we will answer it by coming up with a bias and then imposing the bias and saying that answers the question. That's circular reasoning. So I'm not on board with that.
Yeah. Yeah, Jeff also admitted that his position is rooted in intuition. So it's this sense, this feeling of I'm here right now, and
it's a very popular.
Yeah.
Most people have a very strong sense against my interpretation of the copy problem. I don't deny that my point of view on this issue is not only uncommon or unpopular, but it's definitely not usually the first one. Usually the position you sort of leap to when you quickly think about this is, oh yeah, I mean, I would die in certain uploading procedures. It just makes sense. And it's only if you really sort of think through whether or not there's some strange paradoxes at play that, in my opinion, these initial intuitions just seem to fall over. And that's okay. We have to admit that sometimes our initial gut instinct about the nature of reality isn't right. If you walk out the door and take a quick look around, the Earth looks kind of flat, and you just got to study the world and figure out that that's just not right. It sure looks like the sun's going around the Earth. I mean, that's just, the intuition just seems to make sense. Sometimes intuition is just not the correct answer. And I don't know if our immediate instinct on the nature of our personal identity, especially in these sort of, very esoteric thought experiments about, vision of people, where we're really trying to tease out some very thorny metaphysics. Why should we assume that our gut instinct has informed us of the truth? Maybe that's just not the right answer.
Indeed, maybe it isn't. And that ties into two questions I wanted to ask, which I think are probably the most important right now, because we all know that we constantly get to this point where all of the reasoning that we can carry out brings us to basically Derek Parfit's position, which is also your position. And then there's the gut instinct, which keeps telling us something else, and even for some of us who have cognitively accepted Derek Parfit's position, will make us feel like, well, it does still feel like something happens if there's a copy, and then, that's somewhere else, and I'm here, whatever. So the two questions, I guess, and we can treat them in any order, are, first of all, are there any ways in which Parfit could be wrong, and it turns out that you don't survive mind uploading by copying? And the other question is, what is the path to enlightenment, to finding peace with Parfit's position?
You've been saying that Parfit agrees with me throughout this conversation. I didn't think...
Is that wrong? So am I wrong to say that Parfit agrees with you?
Well, I mean, he gets into this thing that he calls relation R, and he takes that as basically he came to the conclusion that neither body identity nor psychological identity, which is just a fancy way of saying memories, because there are arguments against both, he sort of throws those both out and goes with this relation R thing. And I have a hard time understanding exactly how he defines relation R, but it's this, I think it's this sort of temporally backward relation to your previous self or something. That's okay. You know, my answer to that question was kind of, I wasn't coming together really well on that. Maybe you can help me. I think you'd be looking for some sort of metaphysical force that proves that all of that counter theory works. Do you understand what I'm saying?
A metaphysical force.
Well, I mean, that's the theory, right? The whole point is, I mean, I'm not on board with this, so I have to speak in very sort of devil's advocate terms. But the idea, the counterclaim against preservation of identity, you know, in these various scenarios, is that if you break your stream of consciousness somehow, which I wrote a detailed paper about last fall, dismantling quite thoroughly in my opinion, but nevertheless, if you break your stream of consciousness and then reawaken it in a different way or in some non-causal way, as we discussed earlier in this discussion, that, you know, some sort of metaphysical phenomenon just kind of broke.
Right.
And we can't tap it. So there's some metaphysical chain of identity, and it's not in neurons, it's something else.
It feels...
If you upload by destroying your brain and recreating the same material composition, but without any causal connection. Yeah,
so just judging by the sort of intuitive situations that people seem to be fine with. They're fine with your brain is dormant somewhere for 100 years. It's being preserved, and then you're being reawakened in that brain. Then you're okay, no problem. And they're fine with you have gradual replacement. It seems like people either are okay with just the material persisting and then having their stream of consciousness return, or having their stream of consciousness persist so that in a gradual replacement scenario, it's like the new brain parts the old brain parts can infect the new brain parts with their self.
Right.
That's why, you know, it sounds to me like that gut instinct, this sort of intuition about what works, it acts as if personal identity and self is some sort of virus that needs to, spread and infect somehow. And so if it's still stuck in the material, that's great. Or if it has a chance to spread to the new stuff, that's great too.
Yeah, it really is essentially a discussion about spatiotemporal causality, where one of them is enough, but neither of them isn't. So if you have a temporal continuity, you survive. If you have a spatial continuity, you survive. But if you have neither, this continuity or this causality that they with a big T are concerned about, it can jump back and forth between a spatial or temporal connection. But if you lose it in both cases, then you die. And again, I'm not trying to sound sarcastic, because the point of the question was to give a generous interpretation to this, especially because so many people are very concerned about it. I'm just waiting for somebody to produce any reasonable interpretation of this that actually makes any sense, because it just doesn't to me.
Yeah, that's exactly where I am at with that as well. So I don't know how a person could describe this in a way where you could really see that there's a problem with surviving mind uploading. But then on the flip side, what would you say might be a path to the sort of finding peace with the position that surviving mind uploading is possible in a copying scenario? What is a path for letting go of this gut feeling that seems to require that either you persist through time or you persist through space?
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying very hard to sort of bring the world to that piece through all my writing, but I suppose it's possible that these kinds of things are not, best achieved by rational argument. Nevertheless, that's how I think. So I tend to write articles that are, in my attempts, sort of almost theorem-like they just kind of walk through the reasoning step by step and try to demonstrate that, this point of view, this take on the situation makes sense, and that take on the situation runs into paradoxes and conflicting sort of notions. But I don't know if that will actually change a mind about this, because it's a feeling to begin with. I don't know if you can rationally argue someone out of it. I don't know if I have an answer to the question. I'm not sure how people eventually change their mind about this. I don't know if they do. I don't think I ever desperately changed my mind about this. I sort of had this point of view for a long time, and it might be one of those things where you just have to be lucky enough to have gotten it early, and if you don't, nobody can change your mind. I don't know. I mean, this is what we want to do. We want to help people sort of be comfortable with this, just so that they can be, relatively comfortable with notions of mind uploading that might actually become technically feasible, since the versions that would, sort of follow these causal requirements, such as sort of nanobot replacement, are essentially technically infeasible. So, it's obvious why we want bring people around to view, because it's actually very likely to be the only way that anyone can actually do this.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed, yeah. And as you mentioned, reasoning someone through it may not work, but it is definitely...
Actually are converts, and we could ask them how they sort of changed their mind about it.
Yeah.
I wonder if I could find an example of something like that.
That would be interesting. That would be really interesting. And it could be that even the converts typically just convert rationally, but then not in terms of their gut feeling until later, when they just become accustomed to thinking a certain way, because they repeat it over and over again. So it's sort of how do you indoctrinate yourself? But but we've tried many approaches of just finding out where do these feelings really come from by just walking through a bunch of scenarios. And so most recently we've tried putting together a survey where you kind of walk your way step by step through different possible scenarios, and then you kind of try to find out where is it where we sort of depart and think that no, this is not going to work. Survival doesn't happen here anymore. And it's for instance, we talk about whether brain activity ceasing matters. There's the case of someone going through that hypothermic surgery, and then if that's okay, all right, to the next step. What if we reconstruct a person from their own atoms? If they're okay with that, and if that's done almost instantaneously in a nanosecond, okay, sure, on to the next step. What if there's a little bit of more time, not a nanosecond, but a second between?
But it doesn't work, because as you pointed out earlier in the discussion, a very simple counter-argument or to jump to is to really buy into the notion that there's some sort of threshold where it's working at a certain rate, and then for metaphysical reasons that science has not discovered yet, the whole process just kind of stops working. And instead of rationalizing that doesn't make sense and continuing in the sort of evolution of this state of mind, instead you draw a hard line there and say, see, this is why I can't change my mind about this, because I believe that there is some threshold of replacement rate past which it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And I can't prove it, but that's just like, my brain is stuck there and I can't get past that notion. So that's why you can't just argue someone into changing their mind about it, because there are these sort of unprovable counterclaims that if they decide to take them seriously enough, then that's just a stopping point in the process.
Okay. Well, instead of going on about that, since I think we've reached kind of an end point there, there's one final thing that I would like to ask about. Because, of course, we don't currently we can't currently conceive of a process of carrying out mind uploading through some kind of whole brain emulation that would leave the original intact in the process. So we typically don't talk about such a situation, but in the copy problem, often people do. They talk about, well, if a version of me is constructed somewhere and the original me still exists, if I've survived that procedure and the original brain is still there, how can that over there be me if I'm still here and when I die, I still die, right? That's one thing that comes up, and we have to admit that even if we're not talking about this situation for the initial mind upload, because there's no procedure that we can think of where that happens, later on, if you have an uploaded brain and you make a copy, which is very easy then of course you do end up with that situation where you have two exact duplicates,
right,
but they go on and they live their own lives. Yeah. So how should you think or feel about survival in that situation? Where would you put the survival of, I guess, I don't know if you would talk about sort of identity or survival of psychological continuity or, yeah.
Yeah, as you point out, we don't actually really have to worry about the scenario where the bio-original survives and is uploaded, because that is just so implausible that we may as well just leave that in science fiction for now. But there is a route by which the scan and destroy through the scanning process and then build an emulation later can still produce two uploads just as easily as it produced one. And what is the implication there? You can take that in a lot of directions. I think another reason that people counter-argue against all of this is that the very possibility that you could produce uploads from scan is their proof in and of itself that no identity could have ever survived any scan, even if you only made one. Just the notion that you could have done two means that even if you only did one, now that's the proof of the work. Right.
In the logical sense, those can't be preservation of identity.
Right. Another take is that I've seen philosophers write this, that if you only make one upload, then you're good to go. Your identity survived. But if you make two, then you failed in both cases somehow by making two. Even the one that would have been made no longer counts.
So, to paraphrase Jeff at this point, this was actually the point where he said that example, which comes from Parfit, that example is the one that convinced him, or he finds convincing, to point out that survival, or the sense of survival, has very little to do with persistence of identity, because you can't logically say that if you then have two, that identity continued. That identity must have ceased, and now there are two new identities. Yeah. But survival is more about psychological continuity, or psychological sort of persistence in some sense. And then of course later on he goes back and
response to that. I mean, you can take that approach, but the obvious implication is not so much that survival didn't matter. It's that, well, if you're going to say that, where I'm trying to go with this is what you basically concluded is that your identity, it's just taking uploading off the table, just your identity moment to moment to moment doesn't matter anymore. Like it's just that never was important, which is why if you if you do this sort of double upload and conclude that the identicalness of the two is not important, and the identicalness of yourself to 5 minutes ago was also not important. You're just taking the whole notion off the table. It's not even about uploading there anymore. It's just the same identity of yourself across time is not important. But we're perfectly happy to live our lives the way we currently live them. So obviously something about that is working for us. So if it works for us now, why not just say, well, it works in a double uploading scenario also? I mean, again, it all just comes back around to, if you're okay with it now, then you would be okay with it then. And if you're not okay with it then there's something seriously wrong with the fact that you're okay with it now. Did that make any sense?
It does, and indeed, so the double uploading scenario and the fact that shouldn't lead to a different conclusion than the single upload scenario, that is really an argument against attaching too much value to this notion of personal identity, where personal identity is basically this label that can only exist for one.
Right.
But when I talked to Jeff about that, because he did have an issue with copying versus gradual, that's where then he attached the importance not so much to that, but he attached it onto this sort of the type of causality that was there. It had to be a natural causality leading from one mental state to the next, even if the next mental state exists in two duplicates or something like that. It had to be natural, not the copy version. And so I don't even know what to make of that, but that's where it felt like there was some twisting going on, some going back to, okay, we've accepted that psychological continuity is important, not personal identity, but I still somehow am making an argument that personal identity is what really matters. It needs to infect that new piece of the brain. It sort of goes around in circles then.
Yeah. So the way I did this way back in my book, and then have sort of continued to carry this argument forward, is my definition of sort of what your identity persists as is who you came from, but not sort of who you are elsewhere around in the world right now, and also not who you become in the future. Only who you came from. So for me, identity only works backwards in time.
Yep.
There's no notion of saying that you're the same person that you will be tomorrow, because that person doesn't exist. And you could very well branch by tomorrow, and therefore you can't say which one of them you will be. So it doesn't make sense that way. But you can ask if you're the same person you were yesterday, because there's only one person you came from. And it is weird, because I'm saying it's sort of a one-directional thing. You can only ask an identity question backwards in time. And I'm basically forbidding asking an identity question forward in time, or also laterally, so you can't ask, if you're the same identity as the other upload on the other side of the room. So by simply forbidding the question, then I'm not forbidding it out of a refusal to acknowledge. You identify.
Yeah, for the sake of trying to keep the terminology we use as clear as possible and not confusing issues further, would it be wrong if I suggested that for that kind of claim that we talk about personal continuity or psychological continuity or something like that rather than personal identity, because there was already a way of describing personal identity which logically would have to cease if you make a duplicate, but this version that you're talking about where you can only interrogate backwards, that one would permit duplicates, because of course each copy would look back and say, I am that person from yesterday.
Yeah. The reason that it bumps up against, the reason that there's a problem there is that, again, we start sticking the mathematical version of the word on it.
Yeah.
So if I identify myself with a version of myself from yesterday, and the guy over there identifies himself with a version from the same mental ancestor, then the implication is that he and I must also be identical, because identity just sort of has to sort of infect everything within its sphere. And that's where it all breaks down. And that's why I'm just saying the kind of identity we're talking about here just isn't a mathematical identity. It's some other use of the word. And the use of that word is, and I sound like a broken record because I say this a lot, my use of the word is our memories. Your identity is basically who you remember yourself to be by reflecting on your memories. And the other guy over there on the other side of the room has his own experience of who he remembers himself to be. And the fact that you may share memories up to a branching point and then you have a different set of memories, like, so what? It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that you identify with the person from yesterday and he identifies with the person from yesterday, and you're both right, but you still aren't the same person as each other, because it's not a mathematical identity. It's a personal identity. It's a metaphysical identity. It's not a mathematical identity. We're reusing the word. And by reusing the word, we're just getting ourselves in trouble.
Yeah, so that's why I'm I would prefer not to even use the word identity in there at all. I would prefer to just use something like continuation or something, or whatever, something that doesn't imply a mathematical identity. Now, in a scenario, in a branching scenario, where you, let's say you have the original surviving the copying, and that's how you have this branch happening. And then the original brain lives on for another day. Let's
Yep.
just a hypothetical scenario. Now the copy looks back and has the same recollections, and therefore is a survival of the original in that sense, a continuation. But that original brain did have another hour or another day of experience, and so there's some sort of, yeah, and then they cease to exist, right? How should one look at that in terms of survival of the original?
Right. So, popular argument is that only the original really counted as the bona fide original person, and the copy is just some sort of secondary status copy. But since I only put primacy on memories, I don't really care about atoms. I don't really care about spatial collocal continuity, the fact that the original is sort of in the same place in space. I don't really care about any of that. Other people do, and they'll just say, well, you should care about that, but I don't see why. What is it about any physical notion of my body, or even any spatio-physical notion of where I am? What does any of that have to do with how I psychologically feel about who I am? So for me, it's just the memory, which means that, if you look at this scenario laid across the timeline, there is a branch point, and it is a branch. I mean, it's not that you have a new one and you have an old one. You have a psychological branch into two. And what I'm about to say sounds incredulous, but neither of them is more bona fide or original than the other. They're both just psychological continuations of the original sort of single mental ancestor. And that I just draw a hard stop there. I'm not on board with giving a greater primacy of identity to one of them. So the irony is that scenario, to me, is essentially identical to any other branching scenarios, such as the original dies and you produce two uploads. Makes no difference to me. They're basically the same to me.
All right. I think this is probably a good stopping point, because you've made